Charles James Fox, dubbed a man of the people, was one of the most prominent Whig statesmen of his age. A champion of radical causes, a thorn in the side of George III, and an arch-rival of William Pitt the Younger. Fox entered Parliament in 1768, representing the seat of Midhurst, aged just 19, which was technically underage. The seat had been procured for Charles by his ever-indulgent father, Henry Fox, from Viscount Montague, the patron of this pocket borough. At first, Charles seemed destined to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather and father, who had been a loyal servant of the Crown in Parliament for 25 years, joining the Admiralty Board just a month after his 21st birthday. However, the refusal of the king to grant his father an earldom for his years of service led Charles into a lifetime of hostility towards George III, starting with his resignation from the Admiralty Board in February 1772 so he could oppose the Royal Marriages Act. This was a measure the king wanted passed to prevent wayward royals, like his son, marrying without the consent of the monarch. If Charles did not care for the king, suspecting him of harbouring unconstitutional ambitions, the feeling was mutual. George disliked Charles's rakish habits, believing his friendship with the Prince of Wales was a bad influence, and perhaps not unfairly that.
The excitement of politics enthralled him, but not the routine work of administration.
It is true that discipline was not Fox's forte, likely a consequence of his overly indulgent father. This manifested itself most notably at the gambling table, where Fox racked up enormous debts that required bailouts from his father and friends. In 1744, Charles asked his father to pay gambling debts equivalent to £12.5 million in today's money. While Fox would briefly return to the government benches in 1782, 1783, and 1806, he spent most of his political life in opposition, championing causes decades ahead of his time. He was vigorous, persevering, and had a mind that could simplify and resolve complex problems. He also excelled in both set speeches and debates, with William Wilberforce an opponent on many issues, if not their mutual hatred of slavery, conceding.
You cannot imagine how insipid and vapid our debates are without Fox.
Inspired by figures like Edmund Burke, Fox was drawn into the orbit of the Whig grandee, the second Marquess of Rockingham, becoming a forceful critic of the influence of the Crown, a proponent of moderate parliamentary reform and religious toleration, and an opponent of slavery.
At 22,
Horace Walpole wrote in 1771,
he acted and was hated as a leader of a party, his arrogance and intemperance raising him the enemies of a minister before he had acquired the power of one.
He was also a leading opponent of Lord North's policy towards the American colonies.
Countries should always be governed by the will of the governed,
he said on the 19th of April 1744. He even took to dressing in the colours of General Washington's Continental Army, blue and buff, which soon became the uniform of the Rockingham Whigs. On the fall of the North Ministry, the Rockingham Whigs took office in 1782, with Fox serving as Foreign Secretary. Fox was one of the first to urge that Britain should recognise American independence, but he found himself in disagreement with the Earl of Shelburne, Secretary for Home and Colonial Affairs, who held that this should be a condition of peace. This led to a showdown in Cabinet in June in which Fox was outvoted. This was no isolated dispute between the two men. Fox still harboured resentment for Shelburne's role in frustrating his father's ministerial career. As such, when Rockingham died in July and the King decided Shelburne should take over as First Lord of the Treasury, his Prime Minister, Fox claimed this decision should have been taken by the Cabinet and resigned. Fox not only cited the two men's differences over America, but more pointedly, Shelburne's contempt for the Whig policy of reducing the influence of the Crown. So great was Fox's hatred for Shelburne and the King that he made an alliance with his old foe, Lord North, defeating Shelburne over the peace terms with the Americans and forcing a new Fox-North coalition upon the King. While to Fox, this was the logical culmination of his efforts to reduce the influence of the Crown, to many independent observers, it looked like he had thrown aside his principles for the sake of office. When Fox then tried to reform the East India Company, proposing the creation of a board of largely Foxite governors responsible to Parliament, not the Crown, George made it clear to the Lords that any that went along with this scheme would be his enemy. This succeeded in defeating the bill in the Lords, leading to the fall of the administration and William Pitt the Younger taking office. Parliament was then dissolved an election held, and Pitt returned with a substantial majority. Not for the last time, Fox had found himself out of step with the popular mood, which felt that it was Fox, not the king, who was attempting to overturn the Constitution. This episode convinced Fox that his suspicions of George III had been justified. The king had interfered in the legislative process and dissolved Parliament when its composition did not suit his preferences. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Fox believed that the French were imitating the English Revolution of 1688. It was, he said, the
greatest event that has happened in the history of the world.
This lost him the support of his old friend Edmund Burke and many other conservative Whigs.
Pitt may be the worst of men and Mr. Fox may be the best, but at present the former is in the interest of the country and of the order of things long established in Europe. Mr. Fox is not.
While horrified by the later excesses of the revolutionaries, Fox continued to oppose war with France and Pitt's clampdown on radicalism at home. In this clampdown, again Fox saw proof of his warnings about George III.
I affirm that no attack which the unfortunate family of Stuart made upon the liberties of the country was more alarming and atrocious than that which is intended by the present bills.
Only after Pitt's death in January 1806 was the king willing to countenance Fox's return to government, serving one last time as Foreign Secretary in Grenville's Ministry of All Talents, although even this took months of persuasion to achieve. While Fox was bruised by the collapse of peace talks with Napoleon, he was able to play an important part, despite failing health, in ending the slave trade, a long-term goal. He delivered a passionate speech on the subject on the 10th of June, 1806, as the Commons debated presenting a humble address to the king, calling for the abolition of the slave trade.
So fully am I impressed with the vast importance and necessity of attaining what will be the object of my motion this day, that if during the almost 40 years that I have now had the honour of a seat in Parliament, I'd been so fortunate as to accomplish that and that only, I should think I'd done enough, and could retire from public life with comfort and conscious satisfaction that I had done my duty.
When a bill to abolish the slave trade was introduced and voted upon the following year, there was a majority of 41 votes to 20 in the Lords, and a majority of 114 to 15 in the Commons. The Abolition of the Slave Trade Act then entered the statute books on the 25th of March, 1807. While Fox did not live to see this victory, or many of his other great causes realised, he led a rich and fulfilling life beyond politics. In 1795, he scandalised polite society by marrying his long-term mistress, Elizabeth Armistead, making a home at St Anne's Hill, Chertsey, where he would retreat for comfort and consolation when his political life became too difficult.
You are all to me. Indeed, my dearest angel, the whole happiness of my life depends upon you.
Charles James Fox, man of the people, died on the 13th of September 1806. His funeral, though not a state affair like that of his rival Pitt, who had died earlier the same year, was nevertheless well attended. The entire cabinet turned out to witness the procession following his coffin, which included over 100 MPs and the Prince of Wales. His legislative successes may have been few, but his influence on the politics of his day was profound. His legacy is perhaps best summed up in the election address he gave to Westminster voters in 1790.
To preserve to the people their due weight in the scale of the Constitution, to withstand the encroachments, whether of prerogative or of influence, and above all, to keep alive that spirit of liberty to which this country owes all her greatness, are the objects of my political life.